warm welcome, everybody, to this session with Professor Max Velmans, Experiences of a Self-Observing Universe. Max will be well known to you as students of consciousness studies, and we were just, before you arrived, we were just reflecting that it was 30 years since there was a Ciba-Geigy symposium on consciousness, which then resulted in a publication in 1993. So that's a generation of work that Max has been doing on this topic. For those of you who don't know, he's Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths, University of London, and a Fellow of the British Psychological Society and the Academy of the Social Sciences. And he's actually been involved in consciousness studies for about 50 years. He just celebrated his 80th birthday this year. So that's pretty good going. And among his books are Understanding Consciousness. This develops Reflexive Monism, which you'll be talking about. And then there's a 4-volume collection of major works on consciousness. And he co-edited the Blackwell Companion to Consciousness. So in fact, he's somebody who is absolutely a leader in the field. And interestingly as well, he's served as visiting professor at the Indian Council of Philosophical Research and has had interesting dialogues with Indian scholars. So Max, a very warm welcome to you and to everybody here. Over to you.
Thanks very much, David, and hello, everyone. I'm going to do a quick journey around my own journey, and I'll just share my screen to get us started. Okay. So, experiences of a self-observing universe, and basically I'm going to be talking about both ordinary experiences and extraordinary experiences. There are 5 main stages in what I want to do. I want to give you a little bit of my trajectory, because I think it gives a kind of insight as to why I arrived at the kind of intellectual positions that I did. Then I'm going to begin talking about the substance of the talk and give you a sense of what I mean by the reflexive nature of conscious experience, both in an ordinary sense and in an extraordinary sense. And then I'm going to focus on a few issues which I think have produced a lot of confusion in this field. The first one, which is commonly confused in my view anyway, is the relationship of consciousness to mind. That in turn has implications for the relationship of consciousness to self. And then I want to talk about a really deep issue as well, which I think is attracting a lot of interest these days, which is the relationship of consciousness to energy and matter in the evolution of the universe. So we're literally going to try to say a few things about the ground for being. And for the first bit, I should again reiterate, you had it in your notes, that I've done a much more fulsome talk online, which is on YouTube, about my personal journey. So I'm not going to talk very much about that here. Nevertheless, I just want to say a few things about my own formation and why I got involved in this subject in the first place. As David says, I'm 80, and I was born in Amsterdam in 1942 in occupied Europe under German occupation. And that led to an enormous amount of turbulence in my early life. And so I was in different countries, so Holland, Belgium, Holland, the United States, and then Australia. And there are 11 changes of school, 3 languages, exposure to various social norms, different religions, and so on. So I really was faced with the question of, who am I really, and what kind of belief system do I adopt? What kind of social norms, could I trust? So what kind of religion might I adopt or not adopt? And maybe not surprisingly, I was fairly argumentative. I was skeptical of rigid belief systems, and with respect to the existence of God and so on, I was an agnostic. You could neither prove it, I thought, intellectually, nor could you disprove it. But I was very open, and I very much had, if you like, an existential gap that needed filling, which hadn't been filled, as it is in many people, by a stable history, a sense of where I belonged, who I was, and so on. And another distinct memory which feeds into the later work, I think, had to do with an acute feeling of being disconnected from things. So I had a sense of being limited by my sense organs. Literally, I remember an image of being a goldfish in a goldfish bowl, butting against the edge of the bowl, able to, if you like, experience what's inside the bowl, being offered by my sense organs, but having an acute sense of something being beyond the bowl, but not being able to peer beyond those limits. And I also remember in my teenage years trying to work it all out for myself, really, and my head would spin with theories, and which would go round in circles. It was all unsuccessful, and I was left with a sense of what Ronnie Lang would call ontological insecurity. In spite of that, I did quite well at school, and I went on to do an engineering degree at the University of Sydney. Although even in those days, I was quite interested in philosophy and psychology, and I took those as units in the first year of my degree. And actually, it's just maybe interesting in retrospect to mention that even when I was finishing that engineering degree, I was interested in the nature of mind. And I actually did my final year elective essay on thinking machines. So that was way back in 1963. And at that time, people were already thinking about whether machines could think, for example, drawing on cybernetics, self-guiding control systems, early pattern recognition systems, and so on. But I still had an acute existential sense of lack, of something missing, and in spite of being successful and a graduate engineer and so on, I really felt I had to search the world for maybe somewhere else to live, something else to find, something else to do. And that's quite an interesting journey, but to cut it short, I wound up at Bedford College at the University of London, which was at that time in Regent's College, and eventually merged with Royal Holloway, with the hope of doing what they call a qualifying MPhil. And that meant I had to complete. Well, what I forgot to mention is that I actually started psychology at night while I was studying as an engineer, and hadn't quite completed it. But I then completed that in the final year of a degree at Bedford College. During that year, while I was just doing the same sorts of exams as the final year psychology students, one of my fellow students offered trying LSD. Now, I'd heard about LSD in my travels through Europe before I came to the UK, in between leaving Australia and coming to England. And I remember it was an article by Timothy Leary thinking that if any of what he was saying was even half true, then if I was serious about maybe becoming a psychologist or doing research in psychology and interested in the nature of mind, I ought to really try it, because if there was any truth in it, and I didn't actually look, then there was little chance that I'd be saying anything that might, if you like, penetrate behind the limits of my own sense organs. So she came with a sugar cube, and I think it had 200 micrograms of LSD. We had an interesting experience. The first experience I had was of the world becoming luminous, colors being sharper and tastes being sharper. In fact, the kind of experience was similar in many ways to other experiences that I had later on in life with at the end of silent retreats. So a nice experience, but not to me at the time in any way, if you like, ontologically significant in any way. And so I didn't really take much notice its importance. It wasn't important at the time. And a couple of months later, she asked me again. So I said, okay, I'll do it again. And this time, I think it was the same dose. Something really quite different happened. So to begin with, my visual field pixelated. So it's rather like if you imagine blowing up a print so that you actually see the individual pixels of which the print is composed. So strange, but, you know, again, not very significant. And then I had the thought that it would be interesting to ask what's inside those pixels. So I had the mental experience of actually traveling within a pixel. And then my visual field transformed so that there were many colors and shapes and moving colors of the sort that you might get if you're looking at a painting or a pictorial representation of an LSD experience. Again, interesting, but not in itself significant in any way, not to me. So I asked the same question again. And this time, there were other colors. It was simpler, but still just moving colors and shape of a simpler kind. And so I asked the question again. And this time, I started traveling through something that looked a little bit like that. I actually found that on the web. So it's not something that I've invented. And I had the sense of very slowly moving through it until at the end, I seemed to emerge at the surface of whatever I was moving through. And what I experienced myself as a little cell in this thing that I was experiencing. And it seemed to be a timeless being which existed forever, which all of us were little cells of, and all of us were clustered or clusters within this, which made up its being. And the clusters seemed to relate to each other in a way that similar cells were clustered in some way together, as if we were in families. And as I kept going with this deeper and deeper into the experience, this sense of myself, a little cell, seemed to be glowing more and more brightly. I was standing while I was having these experiences, and when I actually opened my eyes and came back to my body in the room, my head seemed to be filling with light. And then I went back into the experience and gradually became aware of, bright as though I was, there was something immeasurably brighter beyond this thing of which I seemed to be a part, which was connected to the thing of which I was a part. And that there was a band of energy connecting this brighter being to this thing of which I was a part, which was pulling it ever so slowly into evolution. Well, when I thought about that afterwards, there were some puzzling things about it. From the intellectual point of view, one was, did there seem to be two things as opposed to one? And we can come back and talk about that in later years. You know, have various ways of thinking about that. And how could something that was eternal actually be an evolution? And that's something that we can talk about later as well. But it was much more complicated than that. So actually the experience went on for a couple of hours. In fact, the whole experience went on for about 24 hours. Just to pick out a few features of it, to begin with, what I was actually witnessing wasn't like anything I'd read. It wasn't like anything that I expected in any way. And it wasn't even something I could imagine. A second facet of the experience was the fact that it actually seemed more real than what I normally thought of as real. So in the same way that normal reality seems more real than a dream, shall we say, this seemed to be much more real than my normal reality. A third feature of the experience, which was interesting to me, was that it wasn't in any way an inflationary experience. It was obvious to me that whatever was true of me in this process was true for everybody else. And at a certain point, I actually found myself laughing. There was something very funny about the whole thing. What was really funny was that it was obvious from the experience that because actually we were all part of this, that all the differences that we find so important in our everyday lives, the separation and distinctions that we make between ourselves, you know, I'm quite small, other people are quite large, some people are fat, some people are thin, we come in all sorts of colors, shapes, and so on. We have all sorts of social norms by which we judge each other and so on. But we're actually all the same thing, and there was something deeply, deeply funny about that. It was literally a cosmic joke, as if you like, we were fingers on the same hand. Another aspect of the experience that actually gave me some confidence that it wasn't a completely delusory experience was that in a way it was at the end self-negating as an experience, because there was a clear message from the experience that you didn't really need to have such an experience in order to evolve or progress in your life. And that all the information that I needed or anyone needed was actually present in every moment of every day and every interaction in the world, if one just listens to it. And another aspect of the experience, for me anyway, is that that particular experience was non-addictive. So for my entire academic career, and I'm talking about 40 years onwards, I never did anything quite like that again. I didn't need to, in a way, although I had many other experiences and many other explorations as the years went by. Another thing that's worth saying about the experience is that, as you would expect maybe from having an experience like that, completely decontextualized, grounded, you know, in a group or whatever, is that I came back to myself just as I was before the experience. But first of all, there were social consequences of it. And the obvious social consequence was that it wasn't possible to share that experience with others. At first, my thought was, this is amazing, I've got to tell everyone. You know, when I tried to tell anyone at a party or something of that sort, I got what you might call a glazed eye response. And it was obvious to me that it was so strange, if you like, to be talking about something like that in normal life, that there wasn't any point unless you were talking to somebody else who had actually shared similar experiences. The practical consequences of having that experience was that I was still an isolated foreigner. And basically, I'd been living in Australia with an engineering degree. I'd traveled to the other side of the world looking for something else to do, somewhere else to live, out of my social context. I was still hoping to embark on a PhD program, had no financial security or any guarantee of success in doing that. And I was 12,000 miles away from home. Intellectually, when I thought about it afterwards, it was absolutely the case that the ontological significance of the experience seemed to be extraordinary. But I was also still open to the possibility that, well, I'd taken LSD, and maybe that was an effect of a chemical substance on the brain. I didn't really believe it, but I had to be open to that as an actual possibility. And so what I did with it, the influence, if you like, that it had on me, was that I didn't deny the experience anyway. I remembered it. It's now about 55 years ago since I had that experience. I still remember it in detail. And it convinced me that if I were able to actually register to do a PhD, I probably would want to do a PhD on consciousness. So that was the immediate effect. And when I did eventually start doing a PhD on consciousness, I actually got back to my original question as a teenager, which is, how do you get beyond these ordinary senses that we are born with? How do you get to see the world beyond? And it occurred to me from my engineering that I might be able to build a machine that enabled me to do that. And there are lots of ways you can do that. And again, I'm going through this very fast, so it's a little bit unconnected. But I built a machine that could double the range of human hearing. And, was interested in seeing what there was beyond what we could normally hear. And maybe that would give me some insight as to why my hearing range is in the range that it normally is, or why our other sense organs are tuned in the ranges that they are, when physics tells us that there are energies beyond those. And unfortunately, cutting a long story short again, the answer to that was pretty obvious, that our senses are tuned to those energies which are likely to be of most use in everyday human life. And that wasn't going to get me a PhD. And so I reconfigured the device into a kind of hearing aid for the deaf, a new kind of hearing aid for the deaf. That became the subject of my PhD and one strand of my research for many other years. But I haven't got time to talk to you about that, really. So back in 1975, I had my doctorate and was in an academic post. And I really wanted to get back to this question of, how do we understand consciousness? And basically, I was dealing with then understood basic relationships of consciousness to the external world, the brain, and consciousness itself, as is represented in this diagram. And normally when we and a lot of us still think like that, when we think about these three things in the diagram, the physical entity out there in the world, which is a cat there, is separate from the perceiver and the perceiver's brain. So light rays travel from the cat's surface and neural representations form in the brain of the subject. And then something else happens in the brain that supports a conscious experience. And then the subject has an experience of a cat. And we talk about her, in this case, having a percept in her mind or something of that kind. And the question that we have to get to grips with is, how do these three things relate to each other? And if you think about it that way, you're starting to split the universe, if you like. That's a dualist way of looking at things. And so everything above the line is the experience and is consciousness. And everything below that line is physical, the cat, the body of the perceiver, and so on. And it's split it another way as well. So the cat, the object, if you like, on the left of the diagram, is quite separate from everything to do with the subject on the right side of the diagram. So dualism splits the universe in two ways. And then the main reaction to that, as you all know, I'm sure, is materialist reductionism, where the cure for dualist splitting is to try and demonstrate that the experience or the percept in the mind of the subject is nothing more than a conscious state or function of the brain. And I won't bother going into that. I've challenged materialism for decades, really, and I doubt that many of you are materialists. But it's worth noting that even materialism is split. It has a subject-object split. So the cat on the left side of the diagram is the object, and everything on the right side of the diagram is still something to do with the subject. And I was working with that. That was the starting point. There's something mysterious about consciousness. There's something wrong with materialism, that maybe consciousness has something to do with brain and so on. Not quite sure what. And my very first thought about it was that perhaps consciousness is an aspect of the brain's magnetic field. That's back in 1975. And maybe that magnetic field unifies the brain's operations. And I knew if that was the case, because I was an engineer, that might be a way to measure it. But I didn't think that very long. If you think about the physical characteristics of magnetic fields, and you think about the quality of conscious experiences, then it's not at all obvious that those are one and the same. And in fact, well, I won't go into it. You can show that that's pretty devastating for an identity claim. So maybe the consciousness is related to the magnetic field of the brain, but that's a very different thing to saying it just is the magnetic field of the brain. And then, and actually, there's a deeper problem in that first thought as well, which is that the function of consciousness might be to unify the brain's operations. And the deeper problem I had with that, and this is literally within days, is that I wasn't conscious of my own brain's operations. Then you have to ask, how can consciousness cause or affect something that it isn't conscious of? We might need to come back to that later on, because that's a deep and general point that applies across the whole field. And then I had an even bigger challenge to my own presuppositions about the kind of systems that I was dealing with that needed to be explained in some sort of way. And that had to do with actually attending to my own experience. And this is something you can try. And here, the question I was asking myself was, are there really two cats? Is there really a cat as perceived out there in the world, and a percept of a cat in my mind somewhere or in my brain somewhere? And you can try it as well by simply looking at this screen and asking yourself the same question. So as you look at the screen, do you notice any other visual experience in your head or nowhere? Or do you simply see a screen out there in space? And I put it to you that the screen out there in space is the only visual experience that you're actually having. And the same would apply, let's say, if you touch your fingers together and you ask yourself, where's the sensation? Or am I having both a tactile sensation at my fingertips and another experience of a tactile sensation in my brain? And I think you'll come to the same conclusion, that there isn't a tactile sensation anywhere other than in the fingertips. And again, doing this very quickly here, it seemed to me that you had to change something fundamental about the model. So in the case of the screen or the cat out there in space, in order to represent the fact that there really are light rays traveling from the screen or the cat, to my visual system, and something really is going on in my brain, which is instrumental in having an experience of a screen or an experience of a cat, I actually had to represent these arrows coming out and looping back to the entity that I'm actually looking at. And so if putting it in abstract terms, an entity out there in space interacts with me as a perceiver, leading to an experience of an entity out there in space. And that's the beginning of a reflexive loop, the beginning of the introduction of that term into the whole theory that I'm developing here. And I have to give a name to these arrows coming out. That's all, just naming it, which I call it perceptual projection. And basically, all I'm saying when I say perceptual projection is that there are non-conscious processes within the mind, brain, and world in the interaction of these three that produce consciously experienced events, which may be subjectively located and extended in the phenomenal space beyond the brain. And I need to emphasize that perceptual projection is an empirically observable phenomenon. It's not a theory of what's going on. I'm literally naming a phenomenon here. And I also should say that the effect is a subjective psychological effect and viewable only from a first-person perspective. I'm not claiming that something physical is literally being projected from the brain, as, for instance, was suggested by Empedocles. Now, you might find this a bit hard to believe. So normally the physical world presents itself to us as something that just exists in three-dimensional space. And much as we might believe that, our brains and so on are implicated in what we perceive, it's very hard to actually think that actual distance in space is something that is projected by the brain. And so what I've got here is a very nice little illustration of that. And I invite you all with your computers to do this with me. When you're looking at this picture on the screen, I want you to bring your face close up to the screen and focus in the distance behind the screen. So the screen is just a blur. And then gradually, taking your face slowly back from the screen, but keeping your focus at a distance, move back very slowly to where you're sitting. And you should see a double helix with a concave surface extending in three-dimensional space. Now, once you've got it, you can actually look around the diagram and inspect different bits at different depths within it. So there's perceptual projection in action. Okay. I hope you've all got it. But if you haven't, because it's recorded, you can try it later on if you get the recording. So what does all this mean? Well, another demonstration of the ubiquitousness of this phenomenon is the whole phenomenon of virtual reality. And here we have the same diagram again, but in this case, there are no light rays traveling from the cat to the visual system because the cat isn't actually there. That's a virtual cat. But what the system does is actually simulate the actual pattern of light reflectances from a real cat onto the two goggles which the subject is wearing. And because they produce the same pattern of input to the visual system and brain as an actual cat would, the brain models it in the normal way it does and sees what it would see if there were a real cat out in space. And if you generalize this, you can think of, if you like, the entire phenomenal world as a form of virtual reality, which is created by this interaction of the mind, the brain, and the world. And then you can go a step further, because what can be said of this external physical world applies also to one's perceptions of oneself, one's embodiment, for example, in the world. So one's body image is also part of the projection. And in the end, we wind up with a body in the world projection. And if we're in a social world, that includes other embodied beings. And so all of this is part of our conscious experience. And so there's a basic fundamental error, if this argument is right, in the way the mind-body problem is framed, or particularly the consciousness body problem is framed. Because if what I'm saying is right, what we normally think of as the physical world, in other words, the world that we see and touch, the chairs we're sitting on, the screen out here in space and so on, is part of our conscious experience. It's not apart from it. It actually is our conscious experience. And if that's the case, there's something entirely wrong about how the dualist versus materialist debate is framed. We can talk about that later on. And that's the starting point, the very beginning, if you like, of reflexive monism. So what I've been describing is what I call the reflexive model of perception. And as I've just said, there never was a separation between what we normally think of as the physical world and what we normally think of as our conscious experience, because it's the physical world as perceived that we normally take to be the physical world. And in this way of thinking, the phenomenal world can be thought of as a biologically useful representation of what the world is like. Although it isn't, of course, the world as described by modern physics. So, we have a model that we're living in. The model described by physics is quite different. And it is not the thing itself either. And philosophically, what that supports is a form of indirect realism, or sometimes it's called critical realism. It's not idealism, because in this way of looking at things, there is a thing itself, so to speak, in addition to my normal conscious experience. And there are many alternative descriptions of that thing itself, including, for example, the whole of physics. And a closer metaphor would be to think of us living in a sea of energy, if you like. And me and my own body are one kind of vortex, if you like, within this sea of energy, and other objects and other beings and other people are different vortices as well within this sea of energy. And if one is a perceiver, if one is that kind of being, I interact with the sea of energy in which I'm immersed in order to perceive the sea of energy in which I'm immersed, as well as the bit that I think of as myself. And that starts to take you into reflexive monism. But if you go there, you have to do a complete program of intellectual reconstruction, because everything has to be shifted slightly in order to make sense in this other way of looking at things. So you do obviously then have to be much more detailed about how conscious experiences relate to the world described by physics. You have to look again at what you mean by subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and objectivity. You still have to work out how consciousness relates to the brain. You still have to make sense of the causal interactions between consciousness, the mind, the body, and the brain. We still need to have a sense of how consciousness evolves. And then something I'm going to come back to, because obviously I can't do those things in one talk. How does consciousness relate to the mind, and particularly to the unconscious mind, which I touched on earlier? And then what's the self, if you go into that issue? And then finally, what kind of universal initial conditions could in principle produce both an apparently stable physical world of the sort that we normally live in, and our ability to experience that world in the way that we normally do. Now, I do all that in understanding consciousness. So if you're really interested in this and where it all goes, that's the place to look. But let me come back to where I am here now. I've given various talks to SMN, and I like this iceberg model, but it's really quite a nice model or metaphor for the nature of mind. And it's also a classic model that's used in psychology. And the point of the iceberg is that it's a fact about the iceberg that only a tip of the iceberg is actually above the water, and the bulk of the iceberg, I think maybe about 8/9 of it, is below the water. And so a normal conscious experience in this metaphor is just a bit above the water. It's a bit in the light, if you like. And just below that, below the surface of the water, we get the pre-conscious mind and those aspects of the unconscious mind that are closest to consciousness. So that would include the cognitive unconscious. It would include maybe the personal unconscious, if you're looking at it in a psychodynamic way, and so on. Maybe a Freudian way, and whatever. And then you go more deeply into the iceberg, you get more into the territory of the transpersonal and the Jungian, and so on. And then important for me in this metaphor is that the whole iceberg is supported by and embedded by and is product of the sea. And likewise, human consciousness is also a natural expression or a manifestation of the sea, which is in this case the embedding universe. So there never was a separation, in this way of looking at things, between that conscious tip and the rest. It's just the bit that happens to be sticking out of the water. And it's supported by its normally unconscious supporting ground. And if I just reflect on some of the points I'm making here, we can talk about two forms of non-dualism. So that whole explanation of how what we normally think of as the external physical world actually is part of our conscious experience. But the point that actually that's part of my experience, it's not apart from it, is, if you like, a horizontal kind of non-dualism. And the vertical bit, which we've just looked at, the iceberg, if you like, where you see the conscious tip of the iceberg, the present conscious now, it's just the visible part of the unconscious, personal and transpersonal unconscious mind, all the way to the supporting sea, of which it is all an emanation. It's your vertical or internal form of non-dualism. And that, of course, allows one to rethink the nature of oneself. Who am I really? And normally think of ourselves as just being our conscious selves. But basically, I've been arguing that those are generated by and represent aspects of our own pre-conscious minds. They're just the bits of our pre-conscious minds that, if you like, surfaced. And actually, although those are the only bits that have surfaced, we are all of those things still. So we're both the pre-conscious generating processes and the conscious results. And that creates a kind of shift in a sense center of gravity, where our consciously experienced self becomes just the visible tip of our own embedded pre-conscious mind. And note then, this is one of the reasons I keep stressing that consciousness is not the same thing as mind. I want to just note too, but I haven't got time to develop it now, but we might do it in question time, that there are deep resonances with this kind of interconnectedness that I'm talking about, and the integral Vedanta, which is developed by Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Aurobindo, which I found very fascinating. I'm going to come back to that a little bit in a little while. And now I want to get back to quickly to saying a few things about the search for the ground of being. Now, it's a bit of a big ask, obviously, to be trying to say anything at all about the ground of being, because, and I love this phrase, it's a bit like trying to see through a glass darkly, that wonderful biblical phrase. which expresses our existential situatedness with respect to this. But in my view and the work I developed, that doesn't make the ground of being unknowable. So this isn't a Kantian position. I think the ground of being is knowable in various ways. It won't be surprising that if you're using third-person methods of modern physics and cosmology, that's what they're trying to do in their quest for ultimates and a grand unifying theory that somehow incorporates both quantum mechanics and relativity theory. They are literally trying to say, what is the nature of, the fundamentals of the universe? And I, for one, take all that very seriously. We can try and develop more inclusive, integrated theories about the primal conditions that could, in principle, support both the physical universe that we can get a grip of and our ability to experience it in the way that we do. So we can do a kind of reverse engineering, if you like, where we can think, what kind of conditions could have produced all this, i.e. both the stuff and our ability to experience that stuff. And then a third method of exploration, which will be familiar to, I think, probably everyone on this call, is that there are many, many forms of first-person inner exploration. And from the ancients onwards, many have thought that they have been in some way able to touch the ground of being. And I do develop all that in this paper, which is also part of the ad for this talk, is the universe conscious, reflexive monism, and the ground of being. So you can get that online if you want to look at a much more detailed development of the sorts of things I'm doing here. But in the end, then I developed a form of cosmopsychism, which involves an informationally integrated conscious cosmos. And we can know that in two kinds of ways, as I say, as well as the theorizing that I'm doing here. So if we're looking at third-person forms of knowledge of the kind developed by physics, physics itself indicates that at deeper, more fundamental levels of manifestation, as one gets closer to the fundamental nature of the universe, the physical forms become progressively more interconnected and unified, as suggested by quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamic string theory, holographic theories of the universe, etc. And you've heard many talks about that, I think, in SMN. And then, of course, you have also heard many talks about the first-person forms of knowledge and mystical experiences, which also suggest that the primordial cosmos is unified and conscious. Some call it cosmo-consciousness, some call it cosmic mind, the one, the true self, the ground of being, the Tao, many other names. But which is it? If one adopts purely third-person methods of investigation, you might conclude that the ground of being is physical, and a physicist might well do that. But if one adopts a purely first-person approach, you might have an experience that leads you to conclude that it's purely consciousness. So which is correct? And here we get into the interesting problems of philosophy, if you like. In my view, materialism, and this is generally accepted, I'm sure people on this call will also largely accept this, materialism faces the hard problem of consciousness. How could entirely non-conscious physical material create or interact with conscious experiences? What's less well recognized, I think, in this forum is that idealism faces the inverse hard problem of material stuff. It's actually the same problem, inverted. How could the autonomously existing material of the macro-physical world arise from or interact with something entirely non-physical, such as pure consciousness or pure subjectivity? Now, what do mystical experiences tell you? I've got two here, and I'm going to go over slightly because I'm not far from the end, and this bit's really important in my view. So I've picked them out of the Cosmic Game from Stan Grof, 1998. And what's interesting about that book is that from the 6,000 case histories he had access to back in 1998, he was interested in which experiences in particular seem to have ontological significance to those who had them, as opposed to just being interesting experiences or personal experiences and so on. And they come in two types, according to Grof. And this is type 1. So let's just read it through. This is the experience of Robert, who's actually a psychiatrist, age 37. The beginning of my experience was very sudden and dramatic. I was hit by a cosmic thunderbolt of immense power that instantly shattered and dissolved my everyday reality. I completely lost contact with the surrounding world. It disappeared as if by magic. At that time, my only reality was a mass of swelling energy of immense proportions that seemed to contain all of existence in an entirely abstract form. It had the brightness of myriads of suns, yet it was not on the same continuum with any light I knew from everyday life. It seemed to be pure consciousness, intelligence, and creative energy. Note the three things here. Transcending all polarities. It was infinite and finite, divine and demonic, terrifying and ecstatic, creative and destructive. All of that and much more. I had no concept, no categories for what I was witnessing. I could not maintain my sense of separate existence in the face of such a force. My ordinary identity was shattered and dissolved. I became one with the source. Time lost all meaning whatsoever. And then Grof says there's also an experience of the second type. And as he says, it's the identification with the cosmic emptiness and nothingness, described in the mystical literature as the void. However, this cosmic void is far from everyday experiences of emptiness or nothingness. Rather, when we encounter the void, we feel that it is primordial consciousness of cosmic proportions and relevance. We become pure consciousness, aware of absolute nothingness. However, at the same time, we have a strange sense of the essential fullness. This cosmic vacuum is also a plenum, since nothing seems to be missing in it. While it does not contain anything in a concrete manifest form, it seems to comprise all of existence in a potential form. In this paradoxical way, we can transcend the usual dichotomy between emptiness and form, or existence and non-existence. However, the possibility of such a resolution cannot be adequately conveyed in words. It has to be experienced to be understood. So, how do we resolve these two? And actually, I think there is a way of resolving it. And this is where I want to bring in a little bit of integral Vedanta. And this is a quote from the Life Divine, Aurobindo's Life Divine, where interestingly, he's actually considering precisely the issue which we're addressing here. So he says, movement of force being admitted as the whole of the cosmos, two questions arise. First, how did this movement come to take place at all in the bosom of existence? Then he says, well, if we suppose it to be not only eternal, but the very essence of all existence, the question doesn't arise. Then he says that we've negated this theory. What he means here is we've got reasons to worry about this theory because we have something else. We are aware of an existence which is not compelled by the movement. How then does movement alien to its eternal repose come to take place in it? By what cause? By what possibility? By what mysterious impulsion? And he says the answer most approved by the ancient Indian mind was that force is inherent in existence. Shiva and Kali, Brahman and Shakti are one and not two who are separable. And this is really important. Force inherent in existence may be at rest, or it may be in motion. But when it is at rest, it exists nonetheless and is not abolished, diminished, or in any way essentially altered. And that takes me back to reflexive dual aspect monism, where I argue that the cosmic mind is psychophysical. It's a form of conscious energy. If you talk about this manifest world, which we normally live in, which with its subject, object, and internal, external distinctions, these dual aspects of the human mind appear to be respectively physical from an external point of view, or conscious experience from an internal view. But within the ground of being, of course, where there are no subject-object or internal-external distinctions, these aspects resolve into what it is like to be a form of timeless, spaceless, infinite, creative, intelligent energy, a state that can only be experienced to be fully understood. And so in this vision, there's one universe, the thing itself with relatively differentiated parts in the form of conscious beings like ourselves, each with a unique conscious view of the larger universe of which it is a part. Insofar as we are parts of the universe that in turn experience the larger universe, we participate in a reflexive process whereby the universe experiences itself. And that's an ultimate form of holism within which all things and sentient beings interconnect. And that's where it finishes. So I'll stop sharing. Thank you for listening. And I'm sorry I couldn't see you. I was talking to a screen basically, which is a pity. I'd much rather be talking to you. But there we go.
Max, thank you so much. That was brilliant, and really most comprehensive explanation of your philosophy that I've heard. Although, as you say, there are many things that you could develop at greater length. And one of the things there were a couple of things that struck me. One was the resonances with a new thought, which talks about the universal mind, cosmic mind, from the end of the last century. And this whole movement, which the people who were part of it thought was the new psychology, was then overtaken by the third-person view of behaviorism, and that put things back a very long way.
Yeah.
And so I think you're kind of coming to another part of the spiral. So that's one point. The second point is the reflexivity, which is part of your model. And I often use these two quotations, which I think illustrate what you're saying. The first is from Plotinus. We are within a reality that is also within us.
Yeah, nice.
Which is nicely reflexive. And
Yeah.
then Meister Eckhart, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me.
Yeah, I love that. I agree. Both great. Yeah.
And so those are obviously people who are your fellow travelers, as it were. And I don't think you can get anything more profound insofar as these things can be expressed. Those two quotations are pretty good, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, David. Yeah, I love them.
Yeah, thank you very much.